Welcome to the Latin American Perspectives podcast. My name is Alexander Scott, Outreach Coordinator at Latin American Perspectives. Today we will be discussing the main theme of the May LAP issue, Media, Politics, and Democratization in Latin America, with editor Tomás Crowder-Taraborrelli. Tomás is a visiting assistant professor of Latin American Studies at Soka University of America and film review editor and coordinating editor for Latin American Perspectives. He's also a friend of mine, and I've known him for quite a few years now. Good morning, Tomás. It's a pleasure to have you here with me today.
Hi, Alex. Thanks for this opportunity to talk about our issue.
So, to start off, can you briefly summarize for our readers the theme of the May issue?
Yeah, when we started the issue a while ago, a few years ago, with Javier Campo, he's a CONICET researcher from Argentina, currently living in Tandil. We wanted to explore the new media reforms in Latin America. That was our goal. So we went back and looked at Latin American perspectives issues on media, and we found a really great issue called Culture in the Age of Mass Media by Burton and Franco from 1978. So that was our starting point. And they identify three major problems and concepts: resistance, ideological manipulation, and new media technologies, which we use as the starting point for our issue. But as we began evaluating essays and writing our introduction, we realized, of course, that things were changing dramatically. The so-called pink tide came to an end, and we saw the coup against Dilma Rousseff and electoral triumph of Macri in Argentina. So sort of the worst fears came to fruition. This new alliance between media and the judicial system took over Latin America and brought down some key figures of the pink tide wave in Latin America. So the tone of our introduction is more pessimistic than it was when we first wrote the first draft, but we still identify some really interesting points of resistance in technology, in this interesting relationship between grassroots movements, popular movements, and media technology in general.
Can you talk more about the role of mass media in Latin America and how media has affected processes of political democratization and repression?
Well, yes, most researchers that have studied this issue pointed out back in the 1980s that there was this clear alliance, and I think most Latin Americans know that, between the dictatorships and media conglomerates such as Globo or Clarín or Televisa. Now, there were some dramatic changes in technology and the Arab Spring. So many researchers and people working in the film saw that new technologies, of course, allow independent media groups to be able to communicate directly to their audiences through, for example, social networks like Facebook. So that was a sort of a honeymoon period, I think, for new technologies. But then very quickly, we saw how corporations started to take over these social networks. And those that became the most powerful, like Facebook, became key players in national elections. I'm sure most of our readers are very familiar with the roles of organizations like Cambridge Analytica, controlling a part of the electorate that voted for Trump. And now we're discovering that perhaps Cambridge Analytica had something also to do with Macri's election. So now sort of the worst fears of those who had this suspicion that these new technologies would be easily absorbed by corporations sort of came true in the last year or 2 years. So now the question is, how do we resist this? Today, as we are having this dialogue, Mark Zuckerberg is giving testimony in Congress, no, for his role in the last election, or the role of Facebook in the last election. So really, this is a very interesting moment. I think it invites us researchers and invites our readers to think a little bit more deeply about the importance of media technology in the democratic process, the little that remains of it, as we've seen, for example, in the situation in Brazil with Lula's imprisonment and sort of this political crisis that's happening.
In the introduction to the issue, you and Javier discuss how in recent decades many Latin American countries experienced significant legislative reforms regarding the greater democratization of communication media. However, considering the recent political shift to the right in many countries in Latin America, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how the movement for media democratization has been affected by these changes we've seen.
I think they have been greatly affected, unfortunately. Although, as Javier argues, has argued in many of our conversations, I think this left-wing government and popular governments have planted the seed for a potential return to this this widening that we experience in terms of having more access to the media spectrum from grassroots organizations. I don't think everything is as bleak as some people painted, and perhaps I painted it earlier in my response to your questions. I think that there is now an interesting tradition in trying to divide the media spectrum more equitable. The great question remains: how do we fight inequality? It's the same question in terms of economics, no? And media also, of course, is related to economic questions. And I think these reforms that we saw in the 1990s and in the 2000s are great models to return to once this, hopefully, this right-wing wave comes to an end, perhaps with popular resistance organized through social networks too. We see this today in Argentina with the Me Too movement and women and the rest of Argentinians advocating for an access to abortion. We see that a lot of that debates and discussions are happening through Twitter. So I still have a lot of faith in the potential for media reform. I think we're going through a really dark period right now, and the most important thing is try to continue building these spaces where alternative voices can be heard. And a lot of people are doing that, including journalists that were working during the years of the pink tide, working for media conglomerates themselves and are working independently and have their own blogs and their own studios where they film their own shows and distribute them through YouTube, for example.
Building upon that idea of the need to create more spaces, you mentioned this example of these journalists responding. I'm curious, how have grassroots movements responded to these political setbacks? And can you provide some more examples?
Yeah, I think some of our contributors touch on these very points, considering the experiences in Ecuador, for example, or in Mexico with the Zapatistas. Also, with Javier Campo, we review two recent books on Indigenous Media. One of them is by Gabriela Zamorano Villarreal. The title of the book is Indigenous Media and Political Imaginaries in Contemporary Bolivia. I think this type of research clearly demonstrates how there has been an effort between the state, indigenous communities, human rights organizations, and grassroots organizations to build these networks. Bolivia is, I think, an amazing example of how far these alternative media venues can reach. They clearly are advancing a new concept of citizenship, no? And a new concept of a national subject, I think, which is critical now in the 21st century as new generations grow up with these new technologies. And they're very used to having sort of their voices heard, at least through social networks. It's very important to open up spaces for these new voices in terms of political power. That, I think, it's missing right now in most countries in Latin America. Youth feel unempowered, no? And clearly it's because the economic elites are in control at this moment. But I don't think that situation is going to last. But that's just my optimism. But I don't know. We still have to see. There's a good chance right-wing governments like Macri's could stay in power for more than a decade if there is not an immediate reaction by grassroots organizations, human rights organizations, and sometimes political parties.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Tomás, thank you so much for providing us with insight into the dynamic landscape in Latin America.
Oh no, you're welcome, Alex. I invite all LAP readers to please look at our volume. There are some really powerful essays that are looking at the ever-shifting landscape of media in Latin America, which I still think that is one of the although humble in terms of technological power and savviness, I still think it's one of the most cutting edge in the world today.
Absolutely, I totally agree. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. But to our audience, thank you for listening in. And please don't forget to add us on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, YouTube, and all the other wonderful social media sites we have. Please join us again in July for our next podcast. Hasta luego.